And today we're going to talk about quilts. My name is Jane Bowers. I'm the Exhibitions Curator and Manager here at the Wenham Museum. And this is going to be kind of a combination primer about quilts and also a chance for some of you who already know about quilting to see some of the more spectacular quilts that we have in our collection. So I thought I would start with really basic information, which is, what is a quilt? Well, a quilt is always at least two pieces of fabric. So we have one, usually a filler, although not always a filler, but usually a filler, and then a top piece of fabric. So what we've done actually is make a sandwich. And now this is not a quilt yet because it has not been quilted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a needle and thread and I'm going to sew through, come on. I'm going to try to sew through all three layers. There we go. And make a stitch. So there we go. There's a stitch. There's another stitch. And ta-da, we now have made a quilt. It's not a very good quilt, but it is nonetheless a quilt. So that is basically your quilt. That is the sandwich that makes the quilt. So one of the other questions that we get a lot is about quilt patterns, traditional quilt patterns. And there are literally hundreds of them. These are, when I say traditional, I'm talking about Western tradition, European and North American tradition quilts. And there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And most of them are actually just named after the things that they look like. So this is a pattern called Grandmother's Fan. And surprise, surprise, it looks like a traditional hand fan. This is pretty obvious why it's called this. And it is one of the more traditional patterns. These particular quilt squares, and I'm going to go through them one by one, these were all donated to us by the Common Threads Quilt Guild in Topsfield, Massachusetts. The Quilt Guild no longer exists, but they decided to give us these quilts. These were all made in the 20th century. And if you have any questions about the storybook quilts that the Common Threads Quilt Guild gave to us, then I'm happy to answer those at the end of this. But anyway, this one is about patterns. So as I said, this is the Grandmother's Fan pattern. This one that you may have heard of is called Flying Geese. And it looks a little bit like flying geese. As you can see, these triangular shapes, all in formation, and that's where it gets its name. This one is Log Cabin. And it gets its name from the overlapping joints here at the corners, which is exactly how you would build a log cabin. This one is called Postage Stamp, and you can probably figure out why it's called that. It's square, and it's set right in the middle as a cute little square. This one is called Old Tippecanoe. And it's a little bit harder to see, but basically it's called Tippecanoe because these sections kind of vaguely look like, these triangular pieces kind of vaguely look like a canoe. This one is called Variable Star. Again, it's a pretty obvious star pattern. This one may be a pattern called Kite Tails, but our expert quilt, our quilt expert wasn't 100% sure about that. This one is called Anvil, and unfortunately it's a little bit harder to see because the colors are so similar to one another, but if you can see it, the anvil shape is right here, whoops, around here like this. This one is called Churn Dash, and this is in reference to the shape of a churn in a butter churn, and I can demonstrate that for you. We happen to have a butter churn right here at the Wenham Museum that we use for our school programs. And you can see how they look similar. And this one right here, this is called maple leaf. And again, it's pretty obvious. It looks like the shape of a leaf. All right, so there are some quilt patterns. The next thing I thought I would talk about is how quilts are made. So there's several different ways of making quilts. The most traditional kinds are pieced quilts and applique quilts, but there's other types that we're going to talk about in a minute. This particular quilt is a pieced quilt. This particular quilt dates from between 1840 and 1850. It was donated to us by Paul Weaver, who he and his wife collected lots and lots of quilts, and they donated them to us in 2016. Now, piecing a quilt involves actually cutting each piece and then sewing it to the one next to it. This is done over and over and over again. This particular quilt, the pattern is called, I have to look at it. This one is called Compass Rose. It's also called Star for obvious reasons. If you are curious, I actually have in my notes here, the center medallion has 22 points. The second row has 25 points. The third row has 46 points, and the outermost has 68. So each of these little pieces, these diamond shapes, were cut apart and sewn to their corresponding triangle shapes, and then sewn layer by layer by layer. So this is one form or one way of making a quilt. We also have another kind of piecing. It's a similar style. The difference is that this is a kind of pieced quilt known as English piecing or paper piecing. Now, the reason this is called paper piecing is because there are literally pieces of paper on the back. These are all scrap pieces. And what's interesting about these is that they are clearly scraps. Unfortunately, I don't know if the camera is close enough, but you can actually see handwritten notes. These were clearly pieces of paper that were torn apart, or cut apart rather, and used to help the quilt maker piece these pieces together. And what they would do is they would sew the fabric around each piece of paper so they got a nice, clean, crisp line. And then they would sew each little covered piece of paper to its friend next door. And this is called English piecing only because it was a popular style of quilt making in England. So the more proper name is paper piecing because that's actually what they're doing. This particular quilt, we do not know who gave it to us. And so I can't tell you who the donor is, but it is kind of a nice piece to see. Also an example of a quilt top. Now, as I mentioned, we don't have the sandwich here that I was talking about. This is just the top of the quilt with no filling and no backing, but it's a good way to explain how quilts are made and to demonstrate this particular style of piecing. Next, we have applique quilts. Ta-da! Now, this is another quilt that was, whoops, there goes my paper. This is another style of, or this is another quilt rather, that was given to us by the Common Threads Quilt Guild, and this is applique. Now, the difference between an applique and a pieced quilt is that the backing of this is one piece of cloth, and each of these designs was cut out and sewn on separately. So the decoration comes from the applique being put onto the whole piece of quilt, and then the quilting itself is done via sewing around each one of the applique pieces. And I don't know if you can't really tell from the back, but that's an example of applique quilt as opposed to pieced quilt. Now, this spectacular thing. one of my favorites in the collection. I'm going to hold it up so you can get a kind of a better look at it. This is a quilt that utilizes two kinds of quilting. This is applique, as you can see. The white fabric on the background had the green and red pieces appliqued to it and just sewn directly onto the whole piece of cloth. But then the other thing that they used, or the other technique that they used, was called trapunto. Now, trapunto is an Italian word that means quilting, but in the American or the British vernacular, we sometimes call this stuff work. So trapunto in Italian is just general quilting. But when we talk about trapunto in English, we mean this kind of stuffed work here. So the way this is done is they sew the design, and then they leave one side of it unsewn. They stuff it with something stuffy, and then they sew it up again. The other thing that they could do is finish sewing the entire design and then making a slit, stuffing it, and then sewing up the slit. But either way it's done, you end up with this truly spectacular design. I hope it shows well on the camera because this is truly one of my favorites in the collection. This is one of those quilts that was donated to us by Paul Weaver, and it was not hard to decide to take this particular quilt. This is one of my favorites that we actually have in the whole collection. All right, next we have a handkerchief quilt. A handkerchief quilt is a quilt that is literally made from handkerchiefs. Now, I don't know if you can see, but each one of these is a handkerchief. This particular handkerchief quilt was made from storybook handkerchiefs. These would have been children's hankies that you would give to your kids. And they probably were all done in a series because they're all just about the same size. So they were all probably done by the same printer. And the quilt maker chose to take each one of these handkerchiefs and then sewed it to this red ground. So this is another example of a pieced quilt. In other words, there's a piece of fabric and then another piece of fabric, another piece of fabric. It's just in this case, it's a far simpler design because the pattern is actually coming from the pattern of the fabric as opposed to coming from the pattern that the quilter sewed into it. Oh, and here's the yummy, yummy, yummy one. So this one is a whole cloth quilt. And I don't know how well the color is showing on the camera, but it is this amazing saffron dyed yellow silk whole cloth quilt. And the whole cloth refers to a whole piece of cloth being used and the design just being sewn into it with the quilting itself. This is truly a tour de force of sewing. And the material that was used is extremely expensive. Safran is a very expensive kind of dye. It comes from flower stamens, and it is what is used by the Buddhist monks to dye their robes. It's a very special and expensive kind of dye. And the fact that there's this entire quilt made from one large piece of silk that has been woven and then used as the top of this quilt, and then sandwiched with a plainer yellow sateen cotton on the back. But you might actually have a better chance even of seeing the sewn in pattern here on the back without the sheen in the way. This is really one of the more spectacular ones. This particular quilt was given to us by Mrs. E.H. Osgood. And this is actually one of the older quilts that we have in our collection as well. This one dates from between 1780 and 1820. And it's actually pretty spectacular, as you can tell. I'm not enthusiastic about it at all. Moving on. Oh, I'm gonna have to go off camera just for a second so that I can make some room. Back. All right, so this one is a crazy quilt. Again, it's one of my favorite styles of quilt. And as you can see, this particular style is one that doesn't really follow a particular pattern. Crazy quilts are usually made from scraps of the more luxurious kinds of materials that, that people have around when they're making clothing or other things. And they are very often embellished. So you can see here, this particular crazy quilt has been embellished with embroidery, but each row of embroidery is a different pattern, different color. This quilt does follow a little bit of a pattern, only in the sense of, you'll notice there's grandmother's fan here, and you can't see all of it, but here, and also a little bit more towards the front, you can see there is a center medallion, but all the other pieces, and this is a pieced quilt. This is, for instance, this square here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces, but the one next to it is just one square. So this is a particularly popular style, or it was a particularly popular style in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And the interesting thing about this is that they became so popular that people actually started selling crazy quilt kits. So instead of actually having to go through all your own bits and pieces of fabric that you might have in your fabric drawer, wherever you were keeping them, you could actually buy the kit and they would give you instructions on how to put it together. So it was still a crazy quilt, but it was a crazy quilt. The other interesting thing about this particular quilt is that it's another quilt top. And you can see each piece was quilted together onto a whole cloth on the back. And then they were sewn together so that you could make the completed quilt. So on the back, it's actually a little bit less crazy than it appears to be on the front. Now, these are some of the more popular items that we have in our collection. This is a doll quilt. Doll quilts are sort of unique. Lots and lots of people made doll quilts out of scraps so that they could put their dolls to bed and so that they would be happy. What's interesting about these doll quilts, though, is that they were often the first sort of big sewing project that a child might have. This particular doll quilt is a very simple design. They're just rectangles of fabric. And the only thing that makes this kind of fun, or one of the things that makes this kind of fun, is that the material that is used is silk. So these are very fine silk cloths that are used. And they are scraps, obviously, probably from some kind of dressmaking project. One of the sad things that's happening to this particular quilt, and again, I don't know if you can see if the camera is good enough, but the silk is shattering. And this is something that happens to silk when it especially gets hot. When silk is stored in a place where it's too warm, what will happen over time is that you'll get these broken lines of weaving in the silk. And this is one of the reasons why if you have anything silk, don't store it in the attic, don't store it in the basement. Try to store it in a relatively steady, climate-controlled place, because what will happen over time is that the silk will shatter. We also have another doll quilt here. And I kind of love this one because it was clearly someone's first project. You'll notice that it is not evenly sized. It's not a perfect rectangle. And this was designed to go on a 4-poster bed. Now, this top section here, the bigger part of the rectangle, this is a Strippy pattern quilt. And this means that it was just made from strips of alternating fabric. Some of them have been pieced together because probably the maker didn't have a big enough strip, but she attempted, or he attempted, it was probably a she, to get the colors to be even. But this very bottom piece right here, instead of being strippy pattern, this is called Courthouse Steps. And this is in a reference to the squares going around and around. And last but not least, what I love is the art quilt. Well, I love all the quilts, but this is an art quilt. This is another quilt that was given to us by the Common Threads Quilt Guild as part of their storybook quilt project. And this particular quilt is called Cocoa Ice. And the one side of the quilt is the ice side. The other side of the quilt is the cocoa side. And the story of Cocoa Ice is that the cocoa is gathered in the Caribbean and shipped to Maine. And it is a two-sided story in the sense of the girl in Maine writes about her experience with chocolate or cocoa in her cold world, and the girl in the Caribbean writes about her experience with chocolate or cocoa in her warm world. And it's a really, really wonderful story. And the Common Threads Quilt Guild took the story and ran with it and decided to be inspired by that to create this example of both an applique and pieced quilt. It's using two different designs. This quilt was never designed to go on a bed. It was always designed to be a wall hanging, which is why we refer to this as an art quilt as opposed to a traditional quilt. And the other interesting thing about it is that it's two-sided. So depending on which side you want visible, you can turn it around. It's really a truly wonderful, wonderful quilt and one of my favorites that we have. I'll just give you another taste of the other side. There you go. One thing I forgot to mention is that not all quilts are quilts. In this case, we have a doll right here, and you might notice the coat that she has on. So quilts, as I said, with this art quilt, which is actually a wall hanging, can be used for lots of different purposes. And in this case, this is a quilted coat. It is quilted in the crazy quilt style. In this particular case, it was designed to dress this doll, which is another part, another one of the stories from the Storybook Quilt Project, excuse me. So the doll, or the crazy quilt rag coat that was made for this doll, was actually from a book called Rag Coat, or The Rag Coat. And it was designed to illustrate the story in the same way that the Cocoa Ice quilt was designed to illustrate the Cocoa Ice story. And it's just another example of how quilts can be used, and another example of the wonderful quilts that we have here at the Wenham Museum. So if anyone has any questions or would like more information, I would be happy to answer any. I don't see any questions right now, or at least none that I can read. Oh, Early Childhood Partners is saying hello. Thank you. Julie Kaplan is saying hello. Thank you. Karen Bobbergal is also saying hello. So if you are interested in any more programs like this that we might be able to offer, we would love to be able to give you what you would like while we're here in this unprecedented time in our history. And we would love an opportunity to have you tell us what you'd be more interested in seeing. We're planning on some other videos, for instance, along the lines of giving you tours of some of the doll houses that we have. We're also planning on giving you an overview of some of the dolls that we have in our collection, trains, our photograph collections, anything that you're interested in seeing, let us know, and we would be happy to provide some online content for you until you can actually come here and visit us in person. Thank you so much.